When I was 10, I moved in with my dad in a small, unfamiliar town. The only people I knew there were a family my dad was close to, a single mom raising 3 kids on her own. Among them was a girl, 12 years old, a couple of years my senior. Over the next 2 years, we got to know each other bit by bit, though we never became particularly close. Eventually, we ended up sharing some mutual friends. One night, my buddy Rob was hanging out at her place with her and her younger brother. The house was empty since their mom was pulling a late shift at work. Through her job, their mother had recently been assisting a woman she'd grown to know fairly well. In conversations, she'd learned that this woman's sister had just been released from a mental institution. That night, as the three of them were inside, there was a knock at the door. The girl assumed it was her mom. Her mother always had a distinctive way of knocking, and she swung the door open without a second thought. But it wasn't her mom. Rob, who wasn't supposed to be there in the first place, panicked and bolted out through a window, racing back to his house down the road. The person who stepped inside was the sister of the woman their mom had been helping. What happened next remains a blur of horrific mystery, and frankly, I'm grateful I don't know the full details. The younger brother managed to escape to a neighbor's house and call the police. The girl I'd known was brutally murdered just a week shy of Christmas. She was decapitated, her naked body left in the bathtub. Her head was hidden somewhere in the house, possibly among the Christmas presents, and the police had to tear the place apart to find it. I wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. That night left a scar on my memory I'll never shake. This happened to my wife's grandmother about 15 years ago, back when we were still dating. Her husband had passed away a year earlier, and she'd been keeping herself busy by volunteering at the local library in South Texas. It was a way to stay active and connect with people. One winter evening, after the library closed at 5 p.m., she stayed late to finish some extra tasks. The walk home was about a mile through a quiet, lightly wooded area, and since it was winter, darkness had already settled in by the time she left. Another volunteer offered her a ride, but she declined, insisting she needed the exercise to stay in shape. About halfway home, she noticed someone behind her, a man walking in the same direction. At first, it didn't seem unusual. She was elderly and moved slowly, so it made sense he was catching up. But there was something unsettling about him, a vague menace she couldn't quite place. As she kept going, he drew closer until he was right behind her, matching her pace, his presence looming. She could see her driveway ahead, maybe 150 yards away, and had left the house lights on to make it look occupied. Her heart raced, but she told herself she just had to make it a little farther. Then, at about 50 yards from safety, it happened. A heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. A gruff voice growled, "Don't turn around. Hand over your purse, or I'll cut you." She froze for a split second, then took a bold step forward, spun around, and fired the .38 revolver she always carried in her purse. The bullet struck him in the neck. He survived, spending 5 years in a prison hospital before dying of complications. My wife's grandmother passed away last year, but until her final days, she'd say she regretted pulling the trigger too soon. She wished she'd waited to see what he'd do next. Back when I was between 8 and 11, my older sister 7 years, my senior used to babysit me whenever our parents went out. She was a heavy smoker back then, and since my parents wouldn't let her light up inside, she'd step out to the front porch. I'd tag along, bouncing around, probably annoying her while she puffed away. One day, she spotted something odd, a white SUV, parked at the end of our driveway, just sitting there on the road. It had a bike rack on top, and windows so darkly tinted you couldn't see a thing inside. It lingered there until she finished her cigarette and went back in. Then it crept down the street to the church parking lot at the corner and waited. Every time she went out for a smoke, it'd roll back to our driveway and stop. At first, she shrugged it off. She was tough like that, but the next day, when our parents were out again, it showed up once more. I'd watch from the front window if I didn't go out with her, and that SUV just sat there, staring her down. She finally told our dad, who was a sheriff's deputy. He filed a complaint, and the cops came to check it out, but by then the vehicle had vanished. Months passed without a sign of it until about 9 months after it first appeared. It started showing up regularly again. One day, fed up, my sister told me to wait in the carport while she marched down the driveway to confront whoever was inside. Halfway there, she froze. Later, she told us she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like if she took another step, she'd be dead. She turned back and retreated inside. That night, with our family car in the shop, my parents were home, When she went out to smoke, the SUV rolled up again. She sent me to get Dad, who grabbed his gun and strode toward it, not aiming, just holding it. The SUV peeled out, tires screeching onto the highway. Dad noted its make, model, and the chilling detail. Its license plate was covered in duct tape. We never saw it again. I was only 4 or 5 when my parents split up. My mom moved us into a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the first floor. I had my own room, but I always preferred sleeping in her bed when I stayed with her. Our bedrooms faced each other across a short hallway. It was midsummer, and the heat was unbearable, so Mom left the window above her bed open to let in some air. One night, I woke up suddenly and sat up in bed. I noticed our cat perched in the doorway of Mom's room, which was odd. He usually slept curled up with us. The door was open, giving a partial view into my bedroom across the hall. As I watched, he padded into my room and let out a soft meow. I turned to wake Mom, shaking her gently. In the few seconds it took her to stir and ask what was wrong, we both looked back toward the doorway. There, framed in the dim light, was a man stepping out of my bedroom. I'll never forget how fast Mom reacted. She scooped me up and hurled me through the screen window, tumbling out after me. We screamed for help, and a neighbor called 911. The police arrived quickly, but found no signs of a break-in. The front door was unlocked, though Mom swore she'd secured it with both the deadbolt and chain before bed. They figured the man must have slipped out that way. A week later, while cleaning, Mom opened the water heater closet in the kitchen and froze. Inside was a notebook filled with names and crude drawings, alongside a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. The police took it, but could only guess he'd been hiding in our apartment, waiting until we were asleep. The thought still sends shivers down my spine. One day, while I was down in my basement doing laundry, a light bulb flickered and died not in the laundry room itself, but in the other half of the basement. My setup is strange. The laundry room is separated by a wall and a door, and to get upstairs, you have to cross through the unlit section. With that bulb gone, the far side plunged into near-total darkness. I finished folding my clothes, dreading the trek back through the shadows. Halfway across, as I fumbled through the gloom, a sound stopped me cold, a deep, rasping cackle, like a witch's laugh from some old fairy tale, but rougher, as if her throat had been scarred by decades of smoke. It came from right behind me, clear and unmistakable. I didn't think I just ran, heart pounding, up the stairs, and didn't stop until I was safe in the light. I waited until my dad got home before I dared go back down to replace the bulb. That cackle hasn't echoed through the basement since, and I've kept it to myself, not breathing a word to anyone in the house. Sometimes I wonder if it was real or just my mind playing tricks, but the memory of that hoarse, guttural laugh still makes my skin crawl. A friend of mine, Minji, shared this story with me about a year ago. She's in her early 20s and works as an English tutor in South Korea. A few years back, she was helping a high school boy with his studies. One night, they stayed up late cramming, and by the time they finished, the buses had stopped running. He lived too far to walk, so we pleaded to crash at her place just on the floor until the first bus in the morning. Minji hesitated. Letting a teenage male student stay over felt risky and unprofessional. But he kept begging, and against her better judgment, she agreed. They went to her tiny one-room apartment where she climbed into bed, and he spread a blanket on the floor. Exhausted, they both drifted off. Around 2 a.m., the boy shook her awake. "I'm starving," he said. "Let's go get food." Minji blinked at him, groggy and annoyed. "Food? It's 2 a.m. Go back to sleep." But he wouldn't let up, whining about his hunger. She pointed him to some ramen in the kitchen, but he brushed it off. He didn't want that. There was a 24-hour joint nearby, he said, and he pestered her until she reluctantly gave in. They left the apartment and stepped onto the street. As soon as they were outside, he turned to her, his voice low. "I'm not hungry. I woke up and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there." They called the police, who found a homeless man who'd been living in her apartment for 2 months, hiding under her bed. The boy only spotted him because he'd been lying on the floor, giving him a clear view. Minji still shudders thinking how long he'd been there, watching her sleep. I was driving alone from 29 Palms, California to Albuquerque, New Mexico, taking a shortcut through the high desert. The route was nothing but a narrow 2-lane road cutting through endless emptiness, save for a brief pass through Amboya ghost town sinking below sea level, almost as desolate as Death Valley. It was mid-afternoon when I started climbing into the mountains, between Amboy and I, -40. As I wound north through a canyon lined with tall grass, I spotted something odd ahead of me scattered across the pavement. Slowing down, I saw a red Pontiac Fiero parked sideways, blocking both lanes. A suitcase lay open nearby, clothes strewn everywhere, and 2 bodies, a man and a woman, sprawled face down on the asphalt. I stopped about 100 feet back, unease prickling my skin. As a Marine, I trusted my instincts and slid my hand under the seat, pulling out my 9mm and chambering around. Something felt off too staged, too perfect, like a trap waiting to snap shut. Scanning the scene, I mapped a path. I could swerve around the man, past the woman on her right, and slip by the Fiero. I shifted into first, floored it, and followed the line I'd planned, clearing the car without a scrape. A couple 100 feet later, I eased off the gas to catch my breath. Glancing in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The bodies were on their knees, and 20 or so figures emerged from the grass on both sides, converging around the car. I slammed the pedal down and didn't let up until I hit the I-40 on-ramp. I'll never know what they had in store for me if I'd stopped to help or gotten any closer. A few friends and I were night fishing along the James River, settled on the shore with a crackling fire, a few beers, and casual chatter. Out of nowhere, the conversation died like someone flipped a switch. We all turned, staring across the water, gripped by the unshakable feeling that something was staring back. It was eerie, and a few guys tried to laugh it off with bravado, but then a sound ripped through the night, a scream so raw and chilling it froze us in place. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard, a guttural, high-pitched wail like a feral human with no words being torn apart alive. Every hair on my body stood on end. We sat there, paralyzed, until a second scream erupted, even louder and more desperate. That snapped us out of Ithoff. The group bolted to the trucks parked nearby, grabbing rifles and shotguns. When we returned, we huddled by the fire, eyes locked on the opposite shore, watching the flames dance off the rocks. Silence stretched on until a third scream shattered it, this time from our side, just beyond the bushes a yard away. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We ran, abandoning most of our gear, and piled into the trucks. As we sped off, one last scream echoed from the tree line. We never went back to figure out what or was out there. It was a Friday night, and my friend was swinging by to pick me up for a hockey game in the city. We were running late, so I rushed out to his car, laughing and chatting the whole ride. It wasn't until we got there that I realized my phone was missing. I patted down the seats, checked the floor, nothing. I figured I'd left it at home in my hurry. During the game, I couldn't stop worrying I'd dropped it somewhere, so I borrowed my friend's phone and ducked into the bathroom to call my number. After 3 rings, someone picked up but didn't say a word. "Hey, it's me," I shouted. "Just checking if I left my phone at home." Silence. Assuming it was my little brother pranking me, I hung up and went back to the game. I got home late that night to an empty house. I called my parents, who said they'd taken my brother out for dinner and a concert at the park they'd left shortly after I did and wouldn't be back for another half hour. Puzzled, I started hunting for my phone, then stopped dead. If no one had been home, who answered my call? Dread twisted in my gut. Just then, I heard the back door creak open and shut. I didn't think twice. I sprinted out the front to the neighbors and called the police. They found the back door ajar, likely left unlocked by accident, but nothing was taken. The scariest part? Someone had been in my house, close enough to answer my phone, and I might have slept there unaware. A while back, a new family moved in next door. They had a teenage son, 19, who was downright unhinged obsessed with slasher films and always prying for grisly Vietnam War stories from my time in the service, the kind no sane person would want to hear. He'd torment stray animals too, a real disturbed kid. My daughter was only 7, but he'd zero in on her chatting her up as she walked home from school or leaning over the fence while she played in the yard. When he started calling our house asking for her, I lost it. I stormed over, tore into him and his parents, and warned him to stay away or else. After that, things took a dark turn. My daughter's always had a vivid imagination, claiming monsters lurked under her bed or in her closet. So when she said something was living in her closet at night too, scared to come tell us, but gone by morning we brushed it off as kid stuff. Weeks later, my wife and daughter were at my mom's for a girls' night, leaving me home alone. I settled downstairs with some HBO movies and dozed off. Around 2 a.m., the phone jolted me awake. It was the neighbors, frantic, saying their son was missing. "We saw you were up," they said. "He noticed you walking around upstairs with the lights on." My stomach dropped. I'd been asleep on the couch, lights off. I hung up, grabbed my shotgun from the truck, and saw the sheriff pulling up next door. Then I noticed lights flickering in my daughter's room, a shadow pacing inside. The deputies stormed in and found the kid hiding in her closet with a little nest he'd made. He confessed he'd been sneaking in to watch her sleep, in the moonlight. The thought of how long he'd been there still haunts me.